Think about the last time you had to pick a leader. A team captain. A group project lead. A boss. You probably looked for confidence. Height, maybe, without admitting it. A loud voice in the room. Somebody who looked like they belonged in charge. That instinct feels ancient. Primal, even. Like it's wired into you from a time when the strongest man in the cave got to make the rules. Except that's backwards. For most of human history, the loud, dominant, physically threatening guy wasn't chosen as leader. He was the problem the group had to solve. Here's the thing. For roughly 200,000 years, humans lived in small, mobile bands. No kings. No courts. No armies to enforce anyone's will. And yet these groups still had to make decisions, settle disputes, and figure out who spoke first around the fire. So how do you run a society with no boss? The anthropologist Christopher Bohm spent decades trying to answer that, and in 1999 he published findings that quietly rewrote how we think about power itself. Bohm studied dozens of surviving hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies, and he found something almost nobody expected. These groups weren't leaderless by accident. They were leaderless on purpose. Bohm called it reverse dominance hierarchy. In plain terms, the group actively watched for anyone getting too big for their spot by the fire, and the moment someone did, the group pushed back. Not with debate. With ridicule first. Mockery, gossip, deflating jokes aimed straight at the person getting full of himself. If that didn't work, the group escalated to shunning. Ignore him. Stop sharing food with him. Stop listening when he talks. And if that still didn't work, Bohm documented something darker. In extreme, repeated cases, the group would kill him. Let that sit for a moment. Egalitarian societies, the ones we like to imagine as gentle and cooperative, were maintaining that equality through the constant threat of social execution. That sounds obvious once you hear it. Of course people resist bullies. But here's where it gets complicated, because this wasn't just about stopping bad behavior. It was about stopping good behavior too. Skilled hunters who bragged about a kill got mocked just as hard as violent men did. Confidence itself was dangerous. Anyone who looked like they were accumulating status, even earned status, got cut back down. Now, this matters because it means something uncomfortable about you. Your ancestors didn't spend 200,000 years learning to follow strong leaders. They spent 200,000 years learning to tear strong leaders down before they became a problem. But if brute dominance was actively punished, that raises an obvious question. How did anyone lead at all? Somebody had to decide where to move the camp, when to attack, when to retreat, who got which share of the meat. This is where the evidence gets strange, because leadership didn't disappear. It just became situational, and it became something closer to a favor than a throne. A skilled tracker might lead during a hunt, and only during the hunt. Once the group returned to camp, his authority evaporated with the smoke from the fire. A gifted storyteller might lead a ritual. An older woman with deep memory of which plants were safe might lead a migration through unfamiliar territory. Leadership was borrowed, task by task, and handed back the moment the task was done. In other words, they weren't choosing a leader. They were choosing a leadership. Now zoom out, because this pattern of scattered, situational status shows up somewhere you wouldn't expect, in the graves themselves. In 2008, the archaeologist Leo Groman, working out of Hebrew University, excavated a burial in the Hillel-Intacted cave in northern Israel, dated to around 12,000 years ago. Inside was the skeleton of an elderly woman, buried with extraordinary care. 50 tortoise shells arranged around her body. The pelvis of a leopard. A human foot that wasn't her own, deliberately placed beside her. This wasn't a warrior's grave. It wasn't a chief's grave, in any sense we'd recognize. Groman argued this was the burial of a shaman, someone whose authority came not from strength or bloodline, but from a claimed connection to something unseen. Spirits. Animals. The dead. That's the twist. Real status in the earliest human societies wasn't about who could dominate a room. It was about who the group believed could see something the rest of them couldn't. And that idea shows up again and again once you know to look for it. Ritual specialists, healers, dream interpreters, the ones who claim to speak for forces bigger than themselves. Status without threat. Influence without a fist. Here's why this matters. This is where the story stops sounding quaint and starts sounding like a warning. Because none of this happened out of kindness. It happened out of fear. Fear of what one dominant man could do if the rest of the group didn't organize against him first. The entire system of shared power was built on the group's willingness to punish anyone who tried to grab too much of it. Now bring that back to you. Every time you've watched a group quietly turn on someone who was getting arrogant, every time gossip did more damage than a direct confrontation ever could, you were watching a 200,000-year-old immune system still doing its job. The problem is, not everyone agrees this picture is as clean as it sounds. Maybe this was just practical, not moral. A skeptic would point out that small mobile groups had no surplus food to hoard, no permanent territory worth defending, nowhere for a would-be tyrant to store power even if he seized it. Maybe equality wasn't chosen. Maybe it was just the only option available before agriculture gave anyone something worth stealing. And that argument has real teeth. Once humans settled down, started farming, started storing grain that could be guarded, hierarchies reappeared almost everywhere, and fast. Big men, chiefs, kings. The reverse dominance system Bohm described seems to buckle the moment there's suddenly something worth dominating. So maybe egalitarian leadership wasn't a value at all. Maybe it was just what happens when there's nothing to grab. Except that explanation doesn't fully work either, because the mechanism itself, the mockery, the exile, the collective punishment of arrogance, required real social cognition to pull off. Ridicule as a political tool. Gossip as law enforcement. That's not a passive absence of hierarchy. That's an active, coordinated, cognitively demanding project, and Bohm's cross-cultural data suggests it was remarkably consistent across groups with very different environments and resources. In 2008, the psychologist Mark Van Vug proposed something that tried to hold both of these truths at once. Writing in American Psychologist, Van Vug argued that human leadership evolved less through dominance and more through followership. In his framing, leaders in ancestral environments only kept influence as long as followers voluntarily granted it, because unlike other primates, humans had weapons, coordination, and each other. A group of unhappy followers could remove a leader far more easily than a leader could control an entire group by force. So leadership wasn't handed down. It was, in a very real sense, rented. The honest answer is that both things were probably true at once. Circumstance limited what any one person could hoard. And the group actively, deliberately, sometimes brutally enforced the idea that no one gets to keep more than their share, of food or of power. The unsettling part is what happened when both of those breaks came off. Once farming created surplus, and surplus created something worth guarding, the ridicule and shunning that once cut dominant men down to size stopped being enough. The tools built for a world without kings met a world that suddenly had plenty of reasons for one. So the next time you catch yourself sizing someone up for a leadership role, watching for confidence, height, volume, certainty, remember what that instinct actually is. It isn't a search for the strongest person in the room. It's the echo of 100,000 years spent hunting for exactly the opposite.